In the heart of a war-torn Europe, a single man dared to defy the might of a tyrant. He was not a rebel by birth, nor a traitor by choice. He was a soldier, loyal, disciplined, and bound by honor. Yet as the fires of the Second World War engulfed the world, his loyalty began to shift. From a dictator to a nation's soul. This is the story of Claus von Stauffenberg, the man who tried to kill Adolf Hitler. The summer air over Berlin was heavy with fear and fatigue. Bombs fell night after night. Sirens wailed across the city. Germany, once the beating heart of a powerful empire, was now crumbling under its own ambitions. The war Hitler promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing in its sixth. Amidst the ruins of loyalty and despair, a group of men in uniform whispered of betrayal, not against their country, but against its leader. And at the center of their whispered revolution stood one name, Colonel Klaus Philipp Maria Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg. To understand the man who dared to challenge Hitler, we must first journey back, decades before the war, before the madness. Claus von Stauffenberg was born on November 15, 1907, in Jettingen, Bavaria. He came from one of Germany's oldest and most noble families, the Counts of Stauffenberg, a lineage steeped in aristocratic tradition, military service, and loyalty to the old German Empire. As a boy, Claus was bright, disciplined, and idealistic. He grew up surrounded by art, poetry, and music, yet beneath his refined upbringing lay a deep sense of duty to his homeland. He joined the army at a young age, quickly earning a reputation for intelligence and courage. His dedication was not to politics, but to Germany itself, to the idea of a strong, united nation. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, many officers, including Stauffenberg, admired him at first. Hitler promised stability, pride, and revival after the humiliation of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. To many Germans, he seemed like a savior, and Stauffenberg, the loyal soldier, believed that perhaps this strange, charismatic man could restore the honor of the fatherland. But the promise of rebirth soon turned into a nightmare. By the late 1930s, Hitler's regime had transformed Germany into a machine of terror and control. Books were burned, voices were silenced, and loyalty was demanded not to the nation, but to one man. The army, once a bastion of Prussian tradition, now marched under the symbol of the swastika. Officers were forced to swear personal allegiance not to Germany, but to Adolf Hitler himself. It was a chilling moment, and for men like Stauffenberg, it planted a quiet seed of unease. He was loyal, yes, but not blind. He saw the shift from honor to horror, from discipline to fanaticism. Still, in those early years, like many others, he kept his doubts to himself. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. The Second World War begins. Europe once again descends into chaos. Hitler's armies swept across the continent with terrifying speed. France fell in weeks. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, all under German control. The world watched in disbelief as Nazi Germany appeared unstoppable. Inside the Wehrmacht, pride and confusion intertwined. Many officers were proud of their victories, but uneasy about how they were won. Behind the glory, whispers of atrocities began to surface. The burning of villages, the execution of civilians, the rounding up of Jews. At first, such stories were dismissed as enemy propaganda, but over time, the truth became impossible to ignore. Stauffenberg, now a rising officer, began to see the moral decay at the heart of Hitler's empire. He served in campaigns across Poland, France, and North Africa. He witnessed courage, but also cruelty. And with every victory, his respect for Hitler's vision began to crumble. By 1943, Stauffenberg was serving with the 10th Panzer Division in Tunisia. The war in North Africa was fierce and unforgiving. Scorching heat by day, bitter cold by night, and endless death in between. But even as German forces struggled against the Allies, Stauffenberg's faith in the Nazi leadership shattered completely. He saw men dying not for Germany's survival, but for Hitler's pride. He saw civilians treated as expendable, soldiers abandoned, and honor forgotten. The soldier who had once sworn loyalty to the Führer now found himself questioning everything he had ever believed in. In April 1943, tragedy struck. During an Allied air attack, Stauffenberg's convoy was bombed. He was gravely injured, losing his right hand, 2 fingers of his left, and his left eye. For most men, such wounds would end a career, even life, but not for him. As he lay in a military hospital, weak but alive, something began to burn inside him. Not anger, not despair, but conviction. He realized that survival had given him a purpose, a mission greater than his own life. He would no longer fight for Hitler. He would fight against him. As Stauffenberg recovered, he came into contact with others who shared his doubts. Officers, clergy, and intellectuals who saw Hitler not as Germany's savior, but as its destroyer. These men formed the core of the German resistance, a secret network of individuals united by a single goal: to end Hitler's rule and save Germany from total ruin. For the first time, Stauffenberg spoke openly about treason, though to him, it was not betrayal. It was redemption. He said to his comrades, "A man must be ready to act, even if his hands are trembling. For what is obedience worth when the command is evil?" Those words would define him. He was not merely plotting against a tyrant. He was reclaiming his humanity in a world that had forgotten it. By late 1943, Stauffenberg had joined forces with senior officers within the German military command. Among them were General Ludwig Beck, Colonel General Friedrich Olbricht, and Major General Henning von Treschow, men who had long dreamt of removing Hitler, but lacked the means and momentum to act. They had discussed assassination before, but every attempt had failed. Treschow had once tried to smuggle a bomb aboard Hitler's plane, but it failed to detonate. Others had planned to shoot him outright, but fear, bad luck, or missed timing always intervened. When Stauffenberg entered their circle, something changed. He was bold, determined, and willing to die for his cause. And unlike others, he had access. As a staff officer in the reserve army, he could enter Hitler's inner meetings under official orders. He saw opportunity where others saw risk. Slowly, he began to take command of the conspiracy. He reorganized Operation Valkyrie, a contingency plan originally designed to maintain order inside Germany during civil unrest. But under Stauffenberg's vision, Valkyrie would become the weapon to destroy Hitler's regime from within. To betray one's leader is treason. To assassinate him, an unthinkable act for a soldier raised in honor. But as Stauffenberg reflected on the millions of lives already lost, Jews, Poles, Russians, Germans, he knew that silence was the greater crime. Each night he wrote in his journal, questioning not his mission, but his timing. Would history remember him as a traitor, or as the man who tried to save Germany's soul? His faith, once shaken, found clarity. As a devout Catholic, he came to believe that God himself demanded action, that moral duty stood above obedience, and with that conviction he chose his path. The die was cast. By early 1944, the war was lost, even if Hitler refused to see it. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and yet, inside his bunkers and meetings, Hitler spoke of final victory, delusional, isolated, and dangerous. Claus von Stauffenberg, now Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army, stood closer to the Führer than ever before. But in his mind, he was already his executioner. He carried not a weapon of war, but a weapon of hope. A briefcase that would one day shake the foundations of tyranny. The moment was approaching. The plot was forming. And history itself was holding its breath. The winter of 1943 bled into the new year like a slow-dying ember. Germany was still vast and mighty on paper, but inside, its power was rotting. Cities lay in ruins, families starved in silence, and every bomb that fell from Allied skies seemed to echo the same truth. The Reich was doomed. Within the dim corridors of the War Office in Berlin, a handful of officers gathered not to discuss tactics or troop movements, but treason. They were soldiers, sworn to serve their country. Yet what they were about to plan would turn their oaths into weapons. And at the center of it all stood one man, scarred, solemn, and utterly resolved, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg. The plan was born from an existing blueprint, a contingency order known as Operation Valkyrie. Its original purpose was bureaucratic, even dull, a set of emergency measures designed to keep order inside Germany if communication lines collapsed, or if slave laborers revolted. It authorized the Reserve Army, the only force still stationed within the homeland, to seize control of key government and military sites under direct orders from Berlin. But in the shadows of the War Office, Stauffenberg and his allies saw something else hidden within those pages. An opportunity. If Valkyrie could be rewritten, if its orders could be redirected, then the very system built to defend the Nazi state could be used to destroy it. It would not be a spontaneous uprising or a chaotic coup. It would be executed with precision, on official paper, using Hitler's own authority against him. For weeks, Stauffenberg sat hunched over classified documents, reshaping the heart of the plan. Each sentence had to appear legal, every signature authentic. To an outside eye, it was simply a revision of military protocol. But beneath the language of order and obedience lay the skeleton of rebellion. Under his version, the Reserve Army would mobilize the instant Hitler was declared dead. Units would occupy ministries, radio stations, and SS headquarters. The Gestapo would be arrested. Propaganda would be seized, and a provisional government, led by the conspirators, would assume control. They would claim to be protecting the nation from a coup by Nazi fanatics. In truth, they would be delivering Germany from the dictator who had devoured it. One by one, the resistance within the Wehrmacht grew. General Ludwig Beck, the former chief of the General Staff, lent his wisdom and credibility. Colonel General Albrecht provided access to the Reserve Army's command structure. Major General Treskov, still fighting on the Eastern Front, acted as a lifeline to officers who shared their disgust. But outside this fragile circle lay oceans of danger. The Gestapo had ears everywhere, and even a careless word could mean death. Meetings took place behind locked doors, often disguised as routine briefings. Each man knew the price of failure, not only his own execution, but the ruin of his family. And yet, they persisted. Because by 1944, the moral question was no longer if Hitler should die, but how much longer Germany could endure if he lived. When Stauffenberg returned to duty after his recovery, the conspirators found in him the one quality they lacked: decisive courage. He was not content with cautious planning or endless debate. He believed that action, however imperfect, was the only path left. And because of his new position as Chief of Staff to General Fromm, head of the Reserve Army, he possessed something no one else had: direct access to Hitler's conferences. That access transformed a dream into a plan. If Stauffenberg could carry explosives into one of those meetings and detonate them near the Führer, the rest of Valkyrie could be activated instantly. Hitler would be dead, and the reserve army would move before anyone could understand what had happened. For Stauffenberg, the logic was simple. He must become both assassin and savior. Spring melted into summer, and the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy. For the first time, German soil trembled under the certainty of defeat. In Berlin, whispers turned to despair. But in Stauffenberg's office, the whispers became resolve. Day by day, he rehearsed the operation in silence. He studied Hitler's meeting schedules, the layout of the conference rooms, the protocols for entry and exit. He memorized the timer mechanisms of British-made plastic explosives smuggled from the front. Every motion mattered. Pulling the safety pin, placing the briefcase, leaving the room, all with one hand. Because the man who would carry Germany's future into that room had only one good hand and a single eye to guide him. Each movement would be an act of will against pain, against fear, against fate itself. The first opportunity came in early July 1944. Stauffenberg was summoned to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily fortified headquarters in East Prussia. He carried the bomb concealed in his briefcase. His heart pounded not from fear, but from the enormity of the moment. Everything, years of war, loss and doubt, had led to this, but fate was cruelly precise. At the last minute, the meeting was rescheduled. Hitler's air defenses tightened, and Stauffenberg had to leave without detonating the device. Days later, another chance emerged. Again, he travelled to the Wolf's Lair, bomb prepared, will unbroken. But when he arrived, he learned that Himmler and Göring, key figures in the Nazi hierarchy, would not be present. The plan required their deaths as well. Without them, the coup could unravel. Stauffenberg waited, weighing the cost of hesitation against the value of perfection, and again he withdrew. Each failed attempt deepened the risk. Each return flight to Berlin carried the silent question: would there ever be another chance? By mid-July 1944, time was running out. For the conspirators, for Germany, for the world. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombers were reducing cities to ash, and Hitler's paranoia was consuming even his own officers. In one of their final meetings, Stauffenberg spoke quietly to his comrades. They had delayed too long. To hesitate again would be to condemn millions more to die. Hitler must be killed at the next possible moment, regardless of who else was present. The date was set, July 20th, 1944. The night before the attempt, Berlin was unusually still. Thunder rolled over the distant horizon, a storm gathering somewhere beyond the city. In his small apartment, Stauffenberg prepared his uniform. He laid out his medals, polished his boots, and inspected the briefcase that would soon carry death. He wrote a short note to his wife, Nina, though he left it unfinished. There were no grand words of farewell, only the quiet strength of a man who understood what duty demanded. He knew he might not return. He knew that his name would either be cursed or remembered with honor. But above all, he knew that the time for talk was over. As dawn crept over Berlin, he rose, put on his uniform, and stepped into history. At first light, Stauffenberg boarded a plane bound for East Prussia. The engines roared to life, and the ground fell away beneath him. Beside him sat his adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, loyal, composed, and equally resolute. The briefcase lay between them, silent and unremarkable. No one on that aircraft knew that it contained the charge that could end the Third Reich. As the plane sliced through the clouds, Stauffenberg gazed out over the endless forests and lakes of East Prussia. He thought not of glory or revenge, but of duty, to the soldiers dying at the front, to the nation devoured by its leader's madness, to his children who might one day grow up in a free Germany. He whispered a prayer, not for survival, but for success. The plane touched down at Rastenburg shortly before 10 o'clock. The air was humid, thick with the smell of pine and fuel. From the outside, the wolf's lair looked less like a headquarters and more like a fortress carved into the earth. Concrete bunkers hidden among endless woods. Layers of barbed wire, mines, and armed guards. Stauffenberg and Haften were escorted through multiple checkpoints. Every step forward was a step deeper into the heart of the regime they intended to destroy. Inside, officers hurried along corridors, reports in hand, unaware that the man limping past them carried the fate of the Reich in a single case of explosives. At 12:30 p.m., Stauffenberg was informed that the daily briefing would begin shortly, not in the reinforced bunker, but in a lighter wooden conference hut. It was sweltering, and the heat had forced the change of venue. This small detail, the location, the thin walls, the open windows, would alter the course of history. In a side room near the conference hut, Stauffenberg prepared the bomb. With his one good hand, he inserted the detonator capsule and crushed the vial of acid inside the fuse, a mechanism that would trigger the explosion in about 10 minutes. He worked with steady precision, sweat beading on his brow. Time moved differently for him now, measured not in seconds, but in heartbeats. He had intended to arm 2 charges, but with the noise of guards approaching, he could prepare only one. He slipped the briefcase shut, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the meeting room. Each step echoed with the weight of centuries, of wars fought for kings, of loyalty sworn and broken, of the eternal struggle between obedience and conscience. At 12:40 p.m., he entered the conference hut. Dozens of officers stood around a long wooden table, maps spread out beneath a hanging lamp. At the far end stood Adolf Hitler, shorter than legend suggested, his left arm resting on the table, his voice sharp, commanding. Stauffenberg saluted, set down the briefcase near the table leg, and leaned in as if to examine the maps. No one noticed the faint ticking hidden beneath the leather. No one suspected that death was waiting in silence at Hitler's feet. He excused himself, stepping outside under the pretext of a phone call. The guards nodded politely, unaware that history was now counting down its final minutes. Outside, the sunlight glared against the trees. Birds sang, unaware of the storm about to erupt. Stauffenberg walked briskly toward his car, each stride a battle between restraint and urgency. Behind him, inside the hut, the fuse burned steadily toward destiny. The world held its breath. Inside a wooden conference hut in the Wolf's Lair, the most powerful men of the Third Reich stood around a heavy oak table. Maps of the Eastern Front lay spread across its surface. Lines of retreat, red arrows of advance, numbers written in haste. Among them stood Adolf Hitler, impatient and restless, barking orders with a trembling hand. Outside, under the sweltering July sun, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg walked away, his left hand resting lightly on his cap, his mind counting the seconds. The bomb was armed. The clock had begun to tick. It was 12:42 p.m. on July 20th, 1944. Inside the conference room, the faint hum of flies mixed with the scratching of pencils and the shuffling of boots. The briefcase sat under the table, its handle facing outward, pressed against the thick wooden support beam. Just inches away stood Hitler himself, leaning forward to study a report. The device contained a British-made explosive, powerful enough to shred the entire room if placed in open air. But fate, ever cruel, had intervened in the smallest detail. Moments after Stauffenberg left the hut, another officer, Colonel Heinz Brandt, found the briefcase obstructing his view of the map. Annoyed, he casually nudged it to the opposite side of the table leg. That simple act, an instinctive movement, lasting no more than a heartbeat, would decide the outcome of the plot. The bomb was now shielded from Hitler by the thick oak beam. At 12:42 p.m., the fuse reached its end. A blinding flash tore through the air. The conference hut erupted in a violent explosion that shattered windows, lifted the roof, and sent fragments of glass, wood, and steel flying through the smoke. The shockwave rolled through the forest, echoing like thunder across the wolf's lair. Guards rushed toward the inferno, weapons drawn, confusion and screams rising all around. Inside, chaos reigned. Men were thrown to the floor. Flames licked the walls. Bodies lay twisted and motionless in the debris. For a moment, it seemed impossible that anyone could have survived. Outside, in the distance, Stauffenberg paused. He saw the plume of black smoke rising into the sky. He knew what it meant. To him, the mission was complete. Hitler was dead, or so he believed. Within seconds of the explosion, Stauffenberg and his adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Haften, moved swiftly through the compound. The guards were shouting, alarms blaring. Confusion filled the air. No one yet knew what had happened. Using his official status, Stauffenberg bluffed his way past the outer gates, claiming that Hitler's orders required his immediate return to Berlin. The guards hesitated, but allowed him through. At 1 p.m., their car sped down the forest road, dust rising behind them. Minutes later, they reached the airfield. The engines of their Heinkel aircraft roared to life, and as they ascended into the sky, Stauffenberg gazed down at the smoke below, convinced that the tyrant was gone and that Germany's nightmare was finally ending. He turned to Haften and said softly, "The Führer is dead." It was not arrogance, it was relief, the exhale of a man who had risked everything for his country's soul. But down below, amid the wreckage and blood, Adolf Hitler was still alive. The explosion had killed 4 men outright, General Schmundt, Colonel Brandt, and 2 other officers. But Hitler had been shielded by the table leg and the open windows, which vented the blast. He was thrown backward, his trousers shredded, his right arm burned, and his eardrums nearly ruptured. Yet he emerged staggering, alive, his rage burning brighter than his wounds. By 1:20 p.m., the Wolf's Lair had regained control. Telephones crackled to life, and news spread rapidly through the command chain. An assassination attempt has failed. The Führer lives. Within minutes, that message began its journey to Berlin, racing against the conspirators' desperate attempt to seize power before the truth arrived. Stauffenberg's plane landed in Berlin around 3 p.m. He was met by General Olbricht and the small group of officers at the Bendlerblock, the headquarters of the Army Reserve. They gathered in tense silence as Stauffenberg entered the room, his face pale but determined. "The Führer is dead," he announced firmly. "Operation Valkyrie begins now." Olbricht and his aide, Colonel Merz von Kernheim, moved quickly to transmit the coded orders to reserve army units across Germany. The instructions were clear. The SS had attempted a coup. The Führer was dead. The army must restore order. Under those orders, loyal officers would arrest SS and Nazi officials in every major city, seizing control of communication centers and ministries. For the first time in 12 years, the machinery of the Reich began to move against itself. But timing, that merciless master of history, began to betray them. In Berlin, hours passed as key officers hesitated, uncertain of the truth. General Fromm, Stauffenberg's superior, demanded confirmation that Hitler was dead. When phone calls to the Wolf's Lair went unanswered, he wavered, and in that window of doubt, Hitler's survival became known. By 4 p.m., the Führer's aides had transmitted proof, a phone call, a radio message, even a photograph, confirming that Hitler had survived with minor injuries. The propaganda machine roared to life, broadcasting his voice to the nation by nightfall. But at the Bendlerblock, Stauffenberg refused to believe it. He was certain the regime was spreading lies to buy time. He urged the conspirators forward. The coup must continue. It was now or never. Despite the confusion, orders went out across Germany. Reserve army units in Paris, Vienna, and Prague began to act. SS officers were arrested, communications seized, barricades raised. For a brief, flickering moment, it seemed as if the impossible was happening, the Nazi state turning against its master. But the illusion did not last. As news of Hitler's survival reached each garrison, hesitation turned to reversal. Arrests were undone. Orders were rescinded. By 8:01 p.m., the entire framework of Operation Valkyrie was collapsing in on itself. Inside the Bendlerblock, tension turned to chaos. Phones rang, footsteps echoed down the corridors, and panic spread among the officers. Some wanted to surrender, others wanted to flee. But Stauffenberg stood firm, his resolve unbroken even as the walls closed in. He had gambled everything, his honor, his life, his country, and he would not retreat now. Outside, Berlin was falling into shadow. The night of July 20th, 1944, was hot and silent, the streets empty under curfew. Inside the Bendlerblock, the conspirators faced the truth. General Fromm, realizing that Hitler lived, turned on them to save himself. He ordered their arrest. The same army they had tried to use for freedom now came to end their rebellion. At 11:00 p.m., loyal troops surrounded the building. Inside, the lights flickered as Stauffenberg stood before his comrades. Calm as ever, he knew the outcome. There would be no escape, no mercy. But he also knew that history would not end with his death. He had failed to kill Hitler, but he had proven that conscience still existed within Germany's heart. In the early hours of July 21st, 1944, in the courtyard of the Bendlerblock, the conspirators were assembled under armed guard. The air was thick and heavy, the moon casting faint light over the stone walls. General Olbricht, Colonel Merz von Quernheim, Lieutenant von Haften, and Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, 4 men standing side by side. No trial, no ceremony, no last words allowed. Fromm, now desperate to prove his loyalty to Hitler, ordered the execution to be carried out immediately. The shots rang out just after midnight. One by one the men fell. Stauffenberg was the last. Before the bullet struck, he shouted his final words, clear, defiant, eternal. Long live Holy Germany. The echoes of that cry faded into the night, swallowed by the silence of fear that had gripped a nation for 12 long years. By dawn, the coup was over. The Bendlerblock courtyard was silent again. In East Prussia, Hitler sat before a film crew, showing the camera his burned trousers and trembling hands, living proof of his survival. He raged with fury, vowing vengeance upon every traitor who had dared raise a hand against him. Within days, the Gestapo unleashed a purge of unimaginable scale. Thousands were arrested, officers, politicians, even family members of the conspirators. Many were tortured, executed, or driven to suicide. The resistance that had sought to save Germany was shattered. Yet in their deaths, they left behind a legacy that even Hitler could not destroy. For the first time, the world had seen that not all Germans followed blindly, that within the heart of tyranny, courage still breathed, fragile, fleeting, but real. As the sun rose over Berlin on July 21st, 1944, the city seemed unchanged. The Reich still stood. The war still raged. But somewhere, in the quiet spaces between fear and faith, a spark had been lit. The spark of moral defiance. The whisper that one day, this darkness would end. Dawn crept over Berlin like a shadow retreating. The air still carried the echo of gunfire from the Bendlerblock courtyard. The last act of a failed rebellion. The conspirators lay dead, their bodies hastily covered, their names already condemned by decree. Yet their story had only begun. Across the sprawling empire of the Third Reich, the news spread like wildfire. The Führer lives. Propaganda posters appeared overnight. Radio broadcasts filled the airwaves, announcing the miraculous survival of Adolf Hitler. Proof, they said, that destiny itself protected him. The message was clear. Resistance was futile. The hand of God was with the Führer. But beneath that lie, something else had been born. An unspoken truth whispered among the soldiers, the civilians, the broken-hearted. Someone had dared to try. Within hours of the failed coup, the machinery of revenge came alive. The Gestapo, SS, and party tribunals worked without rest. Names were collected. Interrogations began. Confessions forced through torture. Anyone remotely connected to the plot, officers, politicians, pastors, even family members, was dragged into the net. Over 7,000 people were arrested. More than 200 were executed in the months that followed. Trials were conducted in the People's Court, presided over by the infamous judge Roland Freisler, a man whose cruelty was theatrical, almost gleeful. Defendants were screamed at, mocked, and humiliated before being sentenced to hang. The executions were filmed, sometimes carried out with piano wire, a grotesque display meant to terrify all who might still dream of resistance. In the Wolf's Lair, Hitler watched those films personally. He laughed as the men struggled for breath. The vengeance of the dictator was total. The retribution did not end with the conspirators themselves. Their wives and children were taken into custody under the policy of Sippenhaft, kin liability. Entire families were punished for the sins of one. Nina von Stauffenberg, Klaus's devoted wife, was arrested while pregnant with their 5th child. She was sent to a concentration camp, her children separated from her and scattered across orphanages under false names. For months, she lived not knowing if any of them had survived. Only after the war would she be reunited with her family, carrying both grief and pride in equal measure. Others were less fortunate. Some families disappeared entirely, erased from records, their names forbidden to be spoken. The attempt to kill Hitler had failed, but its moral power terrified him. He sought to destroy even the memory of those who had dared oppose him. In the weeks that followed, Germany fell into deeper silence. Fear stalked the streets. Whispers vanished. The army, once the backbone of national pride, was now bound by loyalty oaths stronger than ever. To question the Führer was to invite death. Yet, in secret, the story of the July 20th conspirators spread quietly. Among officers at the front, among priests in confessional booths, among families who had lost everything. They spoke of Stauffenberg's courage, his calm defiance, his last words. They spoke of men who had chosen conscience over survival. They did not call them traitors. They called them the other Germans. By the end of 1944, Hitler's Reich was crumbling. The Allies advanced from the west. The Red Army pressed from the east. Cities lay in ruins, millions displaced, the dream of empire reduced to ash. In his bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler ruled through paranoia and despair. Every shadow looked like betrayal. Every whisper sounded like treason. He trusted no one. Not his generals, not his ministers, not even the people who still called him Führer. The irony was cruel. He had survived the bomb, but the attempt on his life had shattered his sense of invincibility. He withdrew deeper into delusion, convinced that divine forces protected him, even as the walls of his world collapsed. In April 1945, the thunder of artillery echoed across Berlin. The end had come. As Soviet troops advanced through the ruins, Hitler spent his final hours dictating his will, railing against traitors both real and imagined. In the early hours of April 30th, he took his own life. The empire of fear died with him. But when the smoke cleared, when the world counted the cost, tens of millions dead, cities obliterated, nations broken, the question remained: could it have been different if Stauffenberg's bomb had succeeded? History does not answer easily. It only remembers the courage to try. After the war, the world learned the full story of the July 20th plot. Documents, diaries, and testimonies revealed how close the conspirators had come, and how many had risked their lives in silence long before. In post-war Germany, their names were once controversial. For years, some still called them traitors who had turned against their nation. But as time passed, their image changed. They became symbols of conscience, proof that even in the darkest age, there were men and women who refused to bow. Today, the Bendlerblock, once the site of their execution, stands as a memorial, a place of quiet reflection where wreaths are laid each July 20th. A bronze plaque marks the spot where Stauffenberg and his comrades fell. Etched into the stone are his final words: "Long live Holy Germany." Claus von Stauffenberg's journey was not one of glory, but of conviction. He had been loyal once, a soldier shaped by tradition and honor. Yet as the horrors of war unfolded, as millions perished under a flag he once saluted, he saw what Germany had become, and in that realization, he found his purpose, not to destroy his country, but to save its soul. He knew he would likely fail. He knew he would die, but he acted because conscience demanded it. That is the power of his legacy, not the bomb, but the belief that even one man, standing alone, can strike against tyranny. In the decades that followed, Germany faced its past with painful honesty. The July 20th conspirators became part of that reckoning, their names written into textbooks, their portraits hung in classrooms and military academies. The modern German army, the Bundeswehr, honors them as moral examples, soldiers who placed ethics above obedience. Each year, on July 20th, officers take their oath of service before the same memorial where Stauffenberg fell, not to a leader, not to a government, but to the Constitution and the people. It is a vow born from the ashes of betrayal, a promise that never again will blind loyalty replace moral judgment. History often asks, what if the bomb had succeeded? Would the war have ended sooner? Would millions of lives have been saved? Would Germany's name have been spared the stain of absolute ruin? No one can truly know, but perhaps the greater question is this: what does it mean to resist when resistance is hopeless? For Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators, it meant reclaiming the meaning of being German, not through conquest, but through courage. Their act did not save their country, but it saved its conscience. In the courtyard of the Bendlerblock, the wind still moves gently through the trees. Visitors stand in silence, reading the names carved into stone. Some leave flowers, some whisper prayers, and some simply stand, trying to understand what it means to face evil and choose to act, knowing you will fail. Claus von Stauffenberg once wrote in a letter to his wife, "It is time that something is done. He must be killed. The man is evil." Those words, written not from hatred but from duty, became his destiny. He did not succeed in killing Adolf Hitler, but he succeeded in proving that even in the darkest hour of history, humanity's moral light can still burn, flickering, fragile, but never extinguished. The bomb did not end the war. It did not stop the suffering, but it shattered the myth of invincibility. And in doing so, it left behind something far greater than victory. The enduring truth that one act of conscience can echo across generations.